Okay, hi guys, welcome to the second workshop in the Mathematas series. So today we're going to be looking at drawing as sort of one stage in a longer process of development. So we'll be doing some drawings at the start, sort of working to stylize and abstract those. And our ultimate aim is to produce a shadow image, so a sort of three-dimensional shadow installation, basically. Going to be quite relaxed in the way we produce that. I'll go through the materials in a minute. But yeah, basically looking at drawing as a sort of part of a longer development process. We'll be looking at the artist Christian Botansky as an influence in this. Like last week's workshop, there should be a sort of worksheet for you to look at, but we'll talk about him very briefly. We're going to be drawing on some of the themes that he uses in his work to inform our own. And maybe some of those influences to sort of help us in the abstraction or stylization of the sketch that we do that we'll ultimately use to produce our shadow installation. So I thought I might quickly go over some of the items that you're going to need today. Obviously we're going to be drawing, so pens, pencils, anything that you're comfortable drawing and sketching with. Also going to need your scissors for cutting things out later, tape, for assembling things. We've also got wire, and you should have some pea sticks and possibly also a foam box or some block, which will be quite useful for sort of sticking things into to get that assemblage sort of put together. Also obviously a sketch pad for drawing, but also some card and some paper for cutting out later on. So try some different thicknesses of card if you can get hold of them. Obviously some things might flop over if you're just using normal paper, but don't panic too much if you haven't got a huge array of different card or paper thicknesses. There's also some super glue, I think, which is quite useful for sticking paper to pea sticks later on when we get to the assemblage. You may also want to work with tracing paper, partly to help with the abstraction process, but also because it can produce some quite interesting shadows or sort of muted, not quite full shadows when we get to the assemblage. And the design of our actual shadow drawing. So those are all things today to sort of get together before we get started. And so I think now I'll talk a little bit about the artist Christian Botansky. Now this artist is a French sculptor. He's also very famous for his installations and his photography work connected to that. And so a big theme in his work is time, the passing of time, and the present, and making us sort of focus really on those different states and how we feel about them. A lot of his work uses quite fragile materials, so he's often working with sort of thin pieces of metal, card, uses sound a lot in his pieces. And this theme of sort of time passing, or us thinking about time and our place within the grand scheme of time, actually relates back to some much older themes in art. So you might have heard these terms before, but works that we consider to be a vanitas or a memento mori, which were basically paintings generally in the 17th century that got us to think about death, basically. So they wanted you to sort of look at the picture, look at the objects in the picture, and these were all symbols designed to sort of make you reflect on your own mortality, make you aware basically of your presence in the day-to-day, but the fact that you were something that was going to end, that human beings weren't going to exist forever and that you weren't going to exist forever. So often you would have, in these paintings, you'd have images of skulls, obviously, but you might also have fruit and vegetables or flowers, things that we know die in a few days or rot if you leave them out for too long. So having these items in your house was supposed to sort of emphasize your sort of religious virtue, because you obviously weren't highly materialistic, you were spiritual, aware of your own death. And they were philosophical pictures, you know, things to look on and reflect on, and as I say, think about your own mortality. And so Botansky draws on these themes in a lot of his work, and in particular this theatre of shadows, which is the name in English, draws on not only this idea of it being a sort of momentary ethereal sort of situation, as in the shadows themselves are sort of created when the lights go on, but when you turn the lights off, they disappear. It's also drawing on the imagery of celebrations or previous sort of festivities that also focus on death. So there are sort of little devils cut out, skulls, shapes and sort of symbols that we often find in Mexican Day of the Dead celebrations. But also this sort of childlike sort of devilish characters are things that we see in a lot of sort of medieval puppet work. So these were performances, just sort of festival performances that were kind of macabre, a bit childish, but also, again, designed to sort of make you think about your own mortality, the sort of here and now, the present state, but ultimately where you were headed. And so yeah, this work is a work that obviously comes on when you turn the lights on, but it's also the physical assembly of these little metal cutouts, the lights, the fan. If you ever look up this work, you'll see that it's listed as those sort of very particular items like a fan, an electric generator, these cutout metal characters. And that's because this piece of work is what we call an installation. And so what's interesting about this particular form of work is that it's something which is completed by there being a viewer. So artists that make installations are basically creating environments, rooms. They might be quite elaborate, they might be quite simple, like this piece. But the idea is that the piece of artwork isn't actually complete until someone is in the room, in the piece of work, looking at it. Which I think is an interesting theme today, because obviously we're trying to focus not only on what drawing is for us, but also our physical presence. So this piece of work that you're making, it's going to be the design that you assemble with all these different pieces for your shadow theatre. But also it is the shadow, and it is also someone viewing that work. And that's the really important thing to think about with an installation, is that the viewer completes the work. And this was an idea that sort of started to arise in the 1960s, around the time that Botansky started to work. And it was really a reaction to sort of having sculptures, traditional art forms that were a thing that you could own and that could be sold. And so the installation was a reaction to this idea of owning an artwork, because the basic premise was if you weren't actually there experiencing it, completing the work, the artwork didn't exist. So this provides a couple of different themes for us to draw on today. In your worksheet, there's a link to the video of the Shadow Theatre piece by Botansky. If you haven't already watched it, I recommend pausing this video, quickly watching it. It's only a couple of minutes. The voiceover is basically someone reading reflections of Botansky about the work, which is quite an interesting insight into sort of his ideas, and might be something that you want to draw on in your own work. So we're going to start our first 10-minute sketch now, which is basically just to get some information, some different things to focus on, which we will then abstract, stylise and develop into our sort of shadow drawing. Things to think about in this drawing, maybe picking a combination of objects in the room, maybe things that relate to our theme as well. So if you have plants, if you happen to have any skulls or fruit and vegetables, something along the sort of memento mori, vanitas theme could be quite interesting to have as part of this image. Alternatively, you may want to draw sort of a roomscape, which you can then start to sort of manipulate and maybe bring out some sort of scarier elements in our next process. So if you want to draw like the door, the window, start to set up that sort of scene for your shadow image, now's the time basically to collect all the visuals that you might want to play with. You may also want to focus again on your self-portrait, so drawing elements of your face. You could focus in on parts of your face if you wanted to. Remember, we're going to be abstracting these and ultimately producing shadows from them. So we want a sort of range of different forms and shapes which we can then play with in the next stage. So 10-minute drawing, different elements of yourself, things that you're interested in, and things that we can potentially stylise in our next exercise. And we'll start now. So hopefully you've got sort of an image that you're happy with, or certainly sort of a couple of different sketches of different things that you can now work with to stylize in our next exercise. So we'll talk a little bit about abstraction and stylization before we get started. I've got a drawing here of some plants that I've done in my own sort of home studio. I thought these would be interesting shapes for me to play around with. And remember that these are going to be forms and shapes that we're going to be cutting out. So you may want to use your tracing paper to sort of transfer some of them over. You may want to leave some elements as they are and just focus on sections of them to give you some interesting shapes. Because remember, everything that we're sort of producing here is going to become a cutout or an element in a shadow. So it's not going to remain as a two-dimensional piece. It's going to be something that is going to have a projection against a wall or a backdrop. So it's going to change it a little bit. And coming back to the Botansky design, obviously we've got these sort of devil characters, these skulls in there. If you didn't actually have a skull or something sort of as literal as like a devil to draw in your bedroom, which is probably quite unlikely, you may want to take some of the shapes from your original drawing and maybe extend those or exaggerate them, sort of turn them into monsters. Have a think about maybe, children at night being scared of shadows on the wall when you're lying in bed and something you just see in the corner of your eye looks like something, but it's not quite that. Draw on these themes. We're kind of aiming for something which is a little bit macabre, a little bit stylistic. And again, just come back to the Botansky image and have a little think about what you would like to see projected onto a wall. So I've been working here a little bit with those plant drawings I showed you, and just sort of bringing out different elements from the works, things that I'd like to focus on. And as I say, always thinking ahead to the fact that this is going to be something that's sort of going to be cut out and actually using other materials, so our pea sticks and our wire as well. And I was looking at this plant here with its long stems, which I thought was something I could play with, and obviously it's got these sort of little thicker sections on it, which I've just been sort of abstracting here into shapes that I thought maybe down the line I could sort of cut out and stick to my pea stick. I've been playing around with these circles, creating sort of thicker edges on some. I can produce a lot of different shapes that way. And I thought they would be interesting sort of black circles with little cutouts that I can produce in my shadow projection. I was also looking at this Aloe Vera plant with its spikes, and I thought, coming back to the sort of devil theme and catching something in the corner of your eye, it was actually a really good plant just to abstract into something a bit more monstrous. So, turning its sort of luscious, thick vegetation into something which is a bit more threatening in my shadows, or which definitely looks more like a dragon or some kind of demon. So, playing around with all these different shapes, keeping it very simple, thinking about thickness of line, and ultimately kind of trying to think ahead actually a little bit to what I'm going to be projecting. So I'm going to start the timer for another 10 minutes, and we're going to work on sort of abstracting some parts of our drawing, starting to sort of emphasize some bits and maybe develop some more sort of stylistic features from the sort of just normal sketches that we made before. So using all the different elements that you've sort of drawn now, abstracted, these sort of stronger, bolder forms, we're going to start to cut those out, and we're also going to begin to use the wire and the pea sticks to sort of build this puppet theatre, the base, the physical base that's going to produce the shadows. So, things to think about. Obviously you're going to have a light source. Now I recommend using your phone or a lamp if you've got one to create this projection, because we are going to try and document this shadow display once we've actually made it. You've got tape, you've got glue, cut out sections, you can stick them to the pea sticks with the tape or with the glue. The thing about this particular project is, again, we're trying to sort of not be too precious about these things. Christian Botansky famously works with, as I say, very fragile materials, so card, thin pieces of metal. It sort of plays into the idea of this thing not being a forever object, something that might get broken, something that has sort of a lifespan. Think about height levels in this piece as well. If you want things to sit high, obviously distance from the light source is going to create larger and smaller shadows, so it's something to play with over the 30 minutes as well. It might be useful to get a couple of puppets sort of put together and then just start sort of playing around with where you want to position them. And that's another thing I'd like you to think about. You know, as you're making this, what's the artwork for you? Is it the projection that you're creating with the shadows? Is that the thing that you want to sort of be visually interesting? Or do you want to bring some of that design actually into the sort of object, the assemblage that you're making? Is that the thing that's the art object? Is that the thing that you want people to look at and sort of focus on as a designed object? Or does it not really matter to you? Does it matter that this thing looks a bit chaotic but you have a coherent shadow performance? One of the things that's interesting about Botansky's installation is he's moved it to a lot of different locations, and obviously thinking again about this idea of completing the work by being in it, depending on where he puts it, it really changes the effect. So you can imagine seeing this piece of work in a gallery in a big plain white space is very different to viewing it in sort of the crypt of a cathedral, which is one of the locations he's also created it in. Now it obviously helps if you have a plain backdrop as well to practice showing your images on. So if you don't have just like a white plain wall, don't worry. I'm using a piece of wood here, but also, you know, just using a sheet of paper is going to be completely fine in terms of creating a backdrop for your shadow. Okay guys, so I'm going to begin cutting out some of my sections here. And this is actually a really good time now if you really feel like there's an element missing from your design, just to, you know, experiment. You can add new shapes into this as you go along. You know, if you're building the composition and you feel like something's lacking, you know, improvise. You know, create another element and add it into your design. We're constantly developing and changing our composition in this process. It's one of the reasons why I like moving an idea through different materials, because you just have to change and adapt. So I've decided also that I'm actually just going to use some of the, you know, materials, the wire that I've been given to actually create the line. So I'm not necessarily cutting everything out of card. There are some bits that I think I can actually create using some of the other materials that I've got to hand. And in some cases I'm trying to use the sort of like natural bend in the paper to create a bit of depth in my design as well. So folding the card, cutting spirals, just to make sure that the composition and the shadows themselves are more complex than just a flat 2D outcome. Another thing to think about is, how is your design going to stand up? So we use some wire to create a frame for it. Will you use card, cut sections out? Or will you actually make handheld puppets which you can then sort of stand in place? You've also got a foam block to help with this. But obviously whatever you use as your frame is going to have an impact on the shadow that you produce. So for the next 30 minutes we're going to be cutting out elements, taping, sticking them together, really playing around with that composition, sort of working out, you know, which bit are we focusing on, what do the shadows look like, trying to get a really good sort of sense of depth and different scales in our projections depending on where we place the different card cut out pieces as part of our assembled design. Okay, so hopefully you've now completed your sort of shadow assemblage. If you just want to take 5 minutes now to sort of document your shadows, you can. Obviously, we have spoken about installations being completed by the viewer's experience of them, but that doesn't mean that you can't take pictures of your shadows. And you may have decided that the shadows are actually the most important part of the work that you created today, and so that is its own image. So if you want to take 5 minutes to do that now, you can. Otherwise, feel free to do so after this workshop video finishes. And the final thing we're going to do today is just a little bit of an evaluation like we did last time. I will put the slide up, and obviously this is also included on your worksheet, but just a few things for us to think about now that we've finished this exercise. So I'd like you to think about whether or not you enjoyed what we did today, what aspects of it you did enjoy, and what aspects of it you didn't. Did you enjoy the materials that we were working with, or did it feel a little bit too flimsy, a little bit too fragile for you? And for you, what ended up being the most important element? Was it actually the constructed material thing, the assemblage of the different puppets, or was it the shadow that you were producing on the other side? So just a few things there to think about, and as I say, I'll put the slide up for you to have a proper look now. So at the end of this workshop, thanks for taking part, guys, and I look forward to seeing you in the third workshop.